Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Dirty Leather Podcast. My name is Jesse, alongside my co-host Khris. Welcoming you to another edition of our podcast on Stadium Rant. We are very excited for you to join us on this Saturday evening. We're deciding to do this a day early, given the fact that the Super Bowl is tomorrow, and we don't believe that a lot of you will be watching tomorrow. At least this podcast, a lot of you will be watching the festivities of football, for lack of better terms. So we're very happy that you are joining us for your pre Super Bowl festivities a day early. Now, with that being said, of course, like I said, the Super Bowl is tomorrow. But for all baseball fans, spring training is right around the corner, because a couple of days after Super Bowl Sunday, pitchers and catchers will start to report between the 10th, 11th, and the 12th. So baseball, well, you're going to see the pitchers report, you're going to see the catchers report, of course, and then everybody on the roster will come in, and you'll get to see maybe some of your favorite players in new outfits, new team garb, so on and so forth. Maybe you'll like to see Freddie Peralta with the Mets and see how he looks in pinstripe blue, not pinstripe Yankee blue, but pinstripe Met blue, for lack of better terms. And maybe Pete Alonso in new Oriole garb. We'll see what happens with that. But we thank you for joining us on this February 7th edition of Dirty Leather. So with that being said, we're going to get right into our rants. And I'm going to start us off this week with another rant about the New York Yankees. Now, the Yankees are deciding to run it back because they have recently just re-signed Paul Goldschmidt to a 1-year, $4 million contract with a $2 million incentive to at bats, I believe. So if he hits a certain amount of at bats for 2026, he will get that extra $2 million. So it could be up to $6 million for 2026. So the Yankees bringing back Goldschmidt, that's a very interesting move. I said on the last show that the selection, or if he were to sign, it really wouldn't make sense, because you have Ben Rice there, who is arguably, or now is unarguably, or was unarguably and now is arguably the starting first baseman for the New York Yankees. So the reason why they signed him, from my understanding, is that he hits better against left-handed hitters than Ben Rice, which makes him a decent platoon option, and also the fact that he might be a better defensive first baseman than Ben Rice. That's apparently true. I did look at some of the stats. He does have better defensive metrics and better left-handed hitting metric, or righty hitting metrics against left-handers, excuse me. But here's the thing. Goldschmidt is really past his prime. He's going to be 38, if not 39 this year, in 2026. He's not the perennial MVP candidate that we once saw, and he's not the all-star candidate that we once saw 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago. So it's a very interesting move, even mainly because, again, number one, you have Ben Rice, and number two, it seems like the Yankees are really trying to keep what made that 2025 clubhouse work, even with a 94-68 record. Now, of course, they did get Cody Bellinger back about a week or two ago, which is, of course, was their primary target, because if they didn't have Cody Bellinger, they'd be in serious trouble, because Kyle Tucker had already been taken off the market, and he already went to the Los Angeles Dodgers, which is a completely different story. But yes, it's good that they got Bellinger back. Is it good they also got rid of Devin Williams? Yes, because now that opens up a spot for David Bednar to become the lockdown closer and the unquestionable closer for the New York Yankees. And that opens up room for Brendan Beck and maybe another solid rookie bullpen option out of camp, which we'll talk about later. However, here's the problem. The Yankees running it back, even with Aaron Judge, even with Stanton, even with Bellinger, even with Ben Rice and Goldschmidt platooning at first, they're falling behind other teams in the AL East, predominantly the Blue Jays. Now, as you've noticed, Doug is not here, unfortunately, tonight, so he can't speak for the Blue Jays, but I will speak for the Blue Jays. The Blue Jays are looking better on paper, arguably, in terms of their pitching department, at least to start the year, than the New York Yankees. Because don't forget, they recently just signed Cody Ponce and Dylan Cease to large contracts for their rotation, which essentially is replacing Max Scherzer and Chris Bassett. It doesn't look like Bassett's going to be signed with the Blue Jays, and if he does, it might be a bullpen situation there. But with that being said, they also did sign Tyler Rogers to their bullpen, as well as Kazuma Okamoto, who is a very good contact hitting first and third baseman for the Toronto Blue Jays now. Is he going to be Ichiro levels of good? Probably not, but he is definitely a good hitter for the Blue Jays. That's number one. And number two, they are starting to fall behind the Red Sox. And why do I say that? Well, the Red Sox got Contreras at first. They now have Ranger Suarez in their rotation and Sonny Gray in their rotation. And they also did get Brendan Rodgers as a depth piece for their infield to replace whether it be Trevor Story or Christian Campbell at second base, or possibly Alex Bregman at third base if any one of them get injured. And they also did get IKF as well, who's a really decent and a sneaky decent hitter as well as a base stealer. That's the other thing. Really, really interesting moves by the Red Sox and Blue Jays. And if the Yankees are not careful, they could fall behind the Orioles, believe it or not. Because don't forget, the Orioles have made some pretty serious moves with getting Shane Baz from the Tampa Bay Rays in that large trade in January, as well as taking away Pete Alonso from the New York Mets on that 5-year deal, which boosts their lineup a ton. So the Yankees are falling really behind on big time signings. That's the issue. They're not catching up in any form by running it back and waiting for these prospects to come about. Because don't forget, Spencer Jones is in the pipeline. Jason Dominguez is hopefully ready to bloom in 2023 or 26, excuse me. However, he will be starting the year at AAA, which we'll talk about in a minute. But right now, if the Yankees aren't careful, they might fall out of AL East contention completely, if not the playoffs completely. And that's probably going to last until some of these big time contracts start falling off. For example, when Stanton's contract falls off, when Carlos Rodon's contract falls off, when Aaron Judge's contract falls off. So they're locked in a couple of these large contracts, like I mentioned last week. They have about $230 million committed for 2027, and that season hasn't even started yet. So that's the issue here. So the Yankees running it back. Again, they did re-sign everybody aside from Devin Williams, which does save you a couple of $1,000,000, and also Luke Weaver, who was starting to fall apart in the second half of 25. So that does help open some bullpen slots open for, again, younger players, maybe more versatile players. But running it back offensively is not going to get done, especially when everybody around you is making large moves. Like I said, Red Sox getting Ranger Suarez and Sonny Gray for their rotation. Toronto basically upgrading everything with Dylan Cease and Kazuma Okamoto, and the Orioles doing the exact same thing. So that's my rant for this week. But the Yankees really need to consider making some very large moves in 2027, depending on when the lockout ends, if there is a lockout and when and how long that goes. But they really need to start looking toward the future and figuring out how they don't run it back another time or a third time. So that's my rant for this week. So Chris, moving on to you, what's your rant for the week?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I apologize. I've had a cough all day, so my apologies if I end up coughing a lot while I'm talking. But so I would say my rant is going to transition pretty closely into what we're going to be talking about in our next segment. In terms of the catching up on all the signings. And that is the actually a signing that you just mentioned. The Red Sox just went out and did, and that's Isaiah kind of Flaffa. And I I think what he offers is fantastic. I think he's sneaky speed. He's very good defensively. He's got some good base hitting numbers. I worry about the optics of it for the Boston Red Sox, and here's where my rant comes in. We had talked all off season about how the Red Sox were going all in, and that they finally realized they're ready to go and they're going to go all in. They're going to sign who they need to sign, and so far we've made a lot of fantastic trades. Outside of Ranger Suarez, obviously was a very big pickup for us on the pitching side of things. That was our big free agency signing, our only major free agency signing. But we're going from potentially two holes in our infield. Um, One of them being Bregman, who's arguably the biggest piece of our offense last season. Maybe not numerically, but just leadership wise and what he meant for some of the younger players. Two, IFK. And now I don't believe that he's our starting second baseman or our starting shortstop. I think he's a bench piece, and if that is in fact what they're going with, I think it is a very good play because it keeps Sadon from having to come into the infield when inevitably one of our infielders gets hurt, because we know our infielders have some history with that in recent years. And so that is big. But the fan base has very much taken it as that's our starting infield. And Red Sox fans had an absolute meltdown on Twitter. And now listen, Red Sox fans always have a meltdown on Twitter. I don't know if there's been a single signing or play where somebody hasn't been melting down over it. For some, even Ranger Suarez, oh, they're doing pitching when we need offense, whatever it is, Breslow still can't sign a long-term contract. It's still a short-term contract, even though, this, that, the other, whatever. There's always something to meltdown about. I'm sure you understand as a Yankees fan, our fan base is a very volatile and high expectations, but I just think, it feels like a bit of a whimper at the end, given how many potential infielders, we could have gone with that could have been a boost to our lineup. And I think the one, arguably the biggest hole, we've had, especially offensively, but maybe at all last year, certainly, and really since, Mookie has been here, is we haven't had a true power bat in that order. We've had good bats. We've had good offenses, top 10 offenses year in and year out, but we don't have that true power threat. Even Rafael Devers, for all he's a power threat, he maxed out at I think it was about 35 in his best year. Typically he was more in the 20s most year, or very low 30s. We didn't have that power bat. And there were some options out there that would have fit, and even Wilson Contreras, for all of it, it is certainly an improvement at first base. And I will never knock that. I think it's an improvement offensively and defensively, certainly from what we had last year. But he's not a super power bat either. And I think, that is a bit of a concern. And we'll talk more about it when we get to the lineups. We'll talk a little bit more about that moving forward, so I won't get too deep into that. But it very much seems like Breslow's gone full on pitching and defense. I don't know if it's because he whiffed on a couple of the offensive bats and totally changed his philosophy, or if this was always the way he was going and we all just misinterpreted, what they were saying. I don't know. But it definitely seems like that's the way he's going. And I'm not 100% sold that that's enough when push comes to shove. And I do think we've improved. I agree with your points, as far as like gaining on the Yankees. I think Toronto is clearly the best in the division. There's no question about that. I still think we're ahead of Baltimore in that regard, although they certainly made some very interesting moves. I think, and we'll talk about this soon too, but I think there was another move they probably needed to make that they haven't yet. And then Tampa Bay, you can never truly count them out. You just never know what crazy magic they're going to be brewing down there. But I don't know if they've done enough. It worries me that they'll be in a similar position as they were last year, which is fine, but fine isn't great, and to that point, and I think it's something that the Yankees sort of have been doing too. And you mentioned it with the CBA. I don't know if some of these higher spending teams that are near the threshold are hedging their bets a little bit for the CBA and trying to figure out what's going to go on with that before they go soaring over the cap. The Dodgers were already there, so at this point, they're just going to keep spending. But for a lot of the other teams, they didn't really. It was more those middle teams that spent a lot of the money, this offseason. And so I wonder if there's some bet hedging going on there as well. But time will tell, I guess. We'll see.
Yeah, definitely. And with the Tampa Bay Rays, just really quickly, again, I would also not count Tampa Bay out because they have made some serious moves, and they also do have a couple of bats in that lineup. Junior Caminero is a large and upcoming hitter. I think he had something like 35 to 40 home runs in his rookie season, or in his second full season, or in his third full season, excuse me, which is definitely a jump from the 6 that he had last year. And he's only 21. He's going to be 22 this year. And you also have Chandler Simpson, who is a speedster on the base paths. And don't forget, you also do have Rasmussen, Shane McClanahan, who's going to be returning from injury. And you have Ryan Pepio, who is a solid pitcher as well. So Tampa Bay, I agree 100%. That's a team that you might want to watch in the AL East. Are they better than the Yankees? Hard to say. But if the Yankees, like I said, are not careful, they could easily fall behind Tampa Bay as well. Maybe even be last in the division if everything does not pan out, for lack of better terms. So we'll see with that. Now, before we get to the spring training part of our broadcast, we do obviously have to go over at least one major move that happened during between last week's show and this show. Framber Valdez has signed with the Detroit Tigers for a 3-year, $115 million contract with an opt out after 2027. A huge contract, and that comes only about a day. Came about a day before the ruling with regards to Tariq Skubal's arbitration came down, where he won $32 million for 2026, which paves the way for him to be possibly the highest paid pitcher AAV wise in MLB history. Personally, I think this move might underscore that the Tigers might be moving on from Tariq Skubal in 2026, or at least after 2026. Now, here's the reason why I say that. Detroit does have a good amount of cap space, but we know that they operate relatively within the confines of around just under $200 million, usually $200 million, maybe a little bit lower than that. And they also have a bunch of upcoming players who will also be in arbitration. Kerry Carpenter, Riley Green, Spencer Torkelson. They still have Zach McKinstry. Dylan Dingler is going to be hitting arbitration within the next year or so. Tariq Skubal, if he stays with the Tigers, could easily command $40 million a year. That's not even a question. The question is, how far north of 40 million is he going to go to? Is he going to go to 45? Is he going to go to 50, 55 million? Especially with what happens in this contract year or in this last year of arbitration. Because don't forget, he is a free agent after the end of the season. And unfortunately, I don't know if the Tigers are going to be willing to spend a lot because there was already drama enough on the extension talks before this arbitration, and they were far apart in arbitration talks even with that. $32 million from Skubal's camp, $19 million offered by the Tigers. That's a $13 million gap there between both sides, and they were not even close, and none of the sides were even moving, for lack of better terms. So I believe that Framber Valdez will likely be moving at the end of 2026. I don't think he'll be traded during the trade deadline, depending on where the Tigers season is. If they're playoff contenders, he'll likely stay. If they're not, if they start falling apart, if they go under 500, there's no way that they can get back into the playoffs. They'll likely trade Skubal for some type of prospect package, and it would be a large prospect package. And we're talking about a very hefty one. Maybe 4 or 5 different prospects, maybe 4 prospects with 2 MLB ready players. It would be large, but definitely something interesting. Now, the problem with that is that the Tigers are very hitter heavy in their prospects field, in their farm system. Their best pitching prospect, I believe, is Jordan Ham, and he's ranked number 11th in the top 30 for the Tigers. Not a single pitcher in that top 10 for the Tigers. So it would be a very risky move. And you should be very, very careful about what the Tigers do at the MLB draft in 2026 before the deadline. If they go in the first round and draft a large pitcher or draft a well-known or a top-tier prospect pitcher or pitching prospect, excuse me, that might signal the end for Skubal. So my thinking is that Skubal will likely be gone after 2026. If they resign him and maybe move a couple of pieces before then and somehow lock him into a long contract, a very large contract, that's great. That's wonderful. But I believe that the Tigers will move on from Skubal at the end of 2026, and he will be in a new uniform at the beginning of the 2027 season. So what do you think, Chris? Do you think he might be moved? Do you think he's going to stay a Tiger forever? What do you think?
Yeah, so I don't think he's going to be traded necessarily, unless they get absolutely blown away, maybe at the trade deadline or something, and or if they're completely out of it. If all the wheels fall off and something happens and they totally sank, then they may trade him. Otherwise, I think they're going to hold on to him for the season and roll with Valdez and Skubal up at the top of that rotation. That being said, I 100% believe the Valdez signing is to be ultimately his replacement in that rotation. I do believe that I think, and I don't know if the timing just was, coincidental, or if they finally offered lock down that deal immediately after the hearing, after seeing, having the hearing, the arbitration hearing with Scooble. But my gut tells me that they saw where that arbitration hearing was going and knew they were going to lose it, or had a
Mhm.
decent feeling that they were going to lose it, and or may have also got a decent feeling that them bringing him to arbitration, especially valuing him so incredibly differently than the entire rest of the world values him, may have clued them in that he won't want to stay there, even if they want him to stay there. I mean, we talk about, arbitration is always going to be an awkward situation for any player,
Mhm.
because essentially the team is going in there and telling you all the reasons why you're terrible and don't deserve the money you're trying to get. You know what I mean? It's always going to cause a little bit of tension there, But I think for superstar players, some of the players that have been carrying a franchise, which Tarek Skubal certainly has for Detroit the last couple of years, almost single-handedly, getting Detroit into the playoffs, a couple of years ago and working them through the playoffs, almost an automatic win every time he goes out on the mound. That's going to make you feel like you're not valued on that team anymore. And quite frankly, he isn't. If they were, it's not. I mean, a $13 million difference in value is pretty dramatic. And so I think they know he's not going to stay. And whether that's because they don't want to offer him what they know he thinks he's worth, or whether, he's already sort of indicated that, or maybe, in the arbitration hearing, he made some indications there that we're not privy to. I don't know. Obviously, we will never truly know that, but my gut tells me he's gone at the end of 2026, and that they made this move specifically because they now know that, and they're using Valdez as a short-term stopgap. And I do find it very interesting too with Detroit when we talk about how their whole top 10 is offense, because if you remember I don't know how many seasons ago was, maybe three or four, almost their entire top 10 with pitching. So it's very interesting how quickly they shifted that, to being almost all offense. And so, yeah, I agree with you. The draft is going to be very interesting, and it'll be especially indicative if they grab, college pitchers, somebody who they think can move through the system incredibly quickly, too. It's not just any pitching, it's specifically fast moving and MLB ready pitching. That'll be interesting to watch for sure.
Definitely. And again, like I said, that draft for the Tigers is going to be very interesting because there are two, at least at the moment, top 10 ranked left-handed pitchers in the draft leaderboard for MLB Pipeline. That is Carson Bowman and Gio Rojas. Bowman from Southside Christian, and he's committed to Wake Forest if he doesn't sign, and Gio Rojas from Stoneman Douglas in Florida, who's also committed to Miami. So we'll see what happens with that. So depending on where the Tigers rank, they'll likely go for a lefty pitcher. But again, keep in mind that they're they're in a big hole with Tariq Skubal. Like I said, it really depends on where they are during the trade deadline. If they're committed, if they are in the playoff race, he will stay. They will keep him at least for that year. If they're not, they might trade him away and get a large prospect package. But again, it has to be extraordinarily large and with maybe one or two MLB ready players. So we'll see what happens with that. Now, moving on to the spring training part of our broadcast. As you know, like I said, pitchers and catchers are reporting within the next couple of days. And then shortly later this month, we're going to start seeing our first baseball action in Florida and in Arizona with the Cactus and Grapefruit Leagues. So I want to take this time for both of us to go over some of our rosters, our respective teams' rosters, talk about what we like, what we want to see, what we're concerned about, so on and so forth, prospects that we want to see play really well at camp, so on and so forth. So I will start with, of course, the New York Yankees roster. So one of the things that I do like with regards to the Yankees roster is that, yes, and I know this sounds a little bit maybe hypocritical from the start in terms of the rant that we did, but yes, bringing back key parts of your team is very important. Bringing back Cody Bellinger to give left-handed power, especially in a stadium like Yankee Stadium with the short right field porch that helps left-handed hitters. That's a big plus. Keeping Aaron Judge in right field, that's a plus. Of course, he's not going to go anywhere, but I mean, he's the best player in baseball, arguably behind Shohei Ohtani, if you want to argue that. But I still think he's the best player in baseball. You have Stanton, who's returning. You have Chisholm, who's returning. You have who's not going anywhere. I thought he was going to be a trade candidate, but he's ending up staying at second base. You have Ryan McMahon, who was traded to the Yankees at the trade deadline last year. Not a great bat, but a solid defensive third baseman. And that's something that the Yankees have had struggles with for the last couple of years, over the last decade, essentially, finding a solid third baseman to play defense. They had Josh Donaldson a couple of years ago, but he was in his twilight years, for lack of better terms. You do have Jose Caballero, who will be stepping in for Anthony Volpe. So you have some diversity in that lineup. And you also still have a strong core of pitchers for your rotation. Max Fried, Carlos Rodon, Garrett Cole, who will be returning from injury hopefully soon. You have Cam Schlittler, who's up and coming. You have Will Ward, who is a solid fifth option pitcher. You have Ryan Weathers, who will help you through that first month or two of the season while Garrett Cole and Carlos Rodon rehab from injury. There's familiarity, and there's always comfort in familiarity, and you know what to expect from this Yankee team. I don't think they're going to go below 500, obviously, but that's the other thing that I'm concerned about with the Yankee team. It seems like that they made no real meaningful moves in terms of bolstering their lineup. Now, again, how do you bolster your lineup with Aaron Judge and Cody Bellinger coming back? Well, for starters, what about Spencer Jones? What's going to happen to him? Because don't forget, you did bring back Trent Grisham on that 1 year, $22 million or $20 to $30 million qualifying offer earlier in December that he took. And that really jammed up the minors to majors pipeline for the outfielders. So where does Jason Dominguez go? Where does Spencer Jones go? Now we know that Jason Dominguez is going to AAA, or is likely going to start the year at AAA, mainly due to the fact that he had some issues with regards to fielding and left-handed hitting, or left-handed pitching, for lack of better terms, in the majors in 2025. So he'll likely get a little bit more seasoning there, which would likely pave the way for Spencer Jones to be the fourth outfielder behind Ahmed Rosario and Oswaldo Cabrera, who can both play infield and outfield. That's the other thing that I really like about the Yankee team. You have two super utility players that could really play pretty much anywhere that you put them. Ahmed Rosario, who's a good hitter, and you will have Oswaldo Cabrera coming back from that horrible ankle injury that he suffered in Seattle last May. Thankfully, he will be coming back and his career will continue. Looked like his career was over with regards to that injury, but he will be coming back, which is great for him and great news for his entire career. So with that being said, like I said, my concern is that the Yankees did not have large upgrades. I would have loved to see an upgrade in the outfield with Spencer Jones. It looks like it's just going to be Bellinger, Judge, and Grisham again. Maybe Spencer Jones or Grisham doesn't live up to the potential that he showed last year with his power bat. I thought that they might go out and get maybe somebody to replace Anthony Volpe because there were issues with regards to his performance. They ended up keeping him, but he is injured, so he will be down for probably the first month for Jose Caballero to slide into that position. And again, like I said, he's a really good bat. He is very strong with contact, and he also does have speed on the base paths. So that's something to look for. But what I would like to see from this team in spring training is I want to see a level of consistency, a level of high play that the Yankees have always been known for, especially during the 90s and 2000s. Now, that's a very big wish, but it seems like that a couple of the teams have always just seemed to be lacking something. They've always seemed to be lacking spark. Now, in 2024, that could probably be the lone exception because you had Juan Soto on that team. How can you not love a team with Juan Soto? I mean, they did fantastic. They went to the World Series. Now, they got blown out in the World Series and were essentially embarrassed by the Dodgers, except in Game 4, and then had that complete meltdown in Game 5. But what I would like to see in spring training from the Yankees is there needs to be a level of consistent play because, and I think I've mentioned this before in shows past, not this past show, but definitely last year, there were times where the Yankees looked dead last year, especially during the summer where they had terrible stretches of baseball. They had issues with fundamentals, running the bases, fielding the ball, errors galore. They looked off. And then suddenly at the back end of the year, they came back up. And then they went to the postseason where they lost to the Toronto Blue Jays in 4 games in the division series. And unfortunately, you can see some of those cracks begin to form in spring training, unfortunately. So one thing that I will be looking for is whether or not cracks start to form. Is somebody struggling? Are there any major injuries to the rotation? Because you can't afford more injuries to the rotation. Garrett Cole and Carlos Rodon will at least be down until May. Cam Schlittler, you can't afford to lose because he's a very good pitcher. Can't afford to lose your new trade acquisition in Ryan Weathers. And you can't afford really much room for error in that lineup because if somebody goes down, you're going to have to replace him with Ahmed Rosario, Oswaldo Cabrera, who are just borderline. Even though Ahmed Rosario is a decent player, they're still kind of borderline replacement level. So that's something I want to see for the Yankees going forward. I like that they brought back a familiar team. They know what they're going to get. I am concerned about the lack of upgrades to this team, especially in the pitching department with their bullpen and parts of their rotation. But I'm also going to be looking to see if they are healthy coming out the gate, because that's also something that they struggled with, as well as any cracks within their lineup that begin to form, whether that be at the top of the lineup, middle of the lineup, or bottom of the lineup. So I'm going to be paying a close eye to all that. So what do you think, Chris? What are you looking for the Red Sox in terms of the spring training roster?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few things I'm looking at, but also just really quickly, I think the very last point you brought up for the Yankees is going to be crucial for them, and it's their depth. Can their depth survive the first couple of months, especially that rotation? Because obviously you have one of the best rotations in baseball when healthy, but they're not going to start off healthy. So will that depth be challenged early? Will we see any sort of backslides from any players? How well will they be able to hold up? I think how those first 2 months go for your starting pitching is going to be really reflective of how the full season ends up
Yes.
going, and so it'll be very interesting to watch for. So for the Red Sox, I feel like a good portion of their roster is already pretty well locked in, and in a pretty good shape. At least coming into spring training. But there's always injuries in spring training that change that outlook and everything, especially with the World Baseball Classic happening this year too. You just never know. Obviously a few years ago, the Mets believed that their bullpen was in great shape, and then they lost, Diaz for the year. So you just never know. But the front of that rotation is we talked about it, last week. One of the best in baseball with Crochet, Suarez, Gray, and Bayo. And then you've got a handful of additional pieces that can slide into that fifth spot. And I am watching to see who ultimately gets that nod. And the names sort of out there right now, obviously Oviedo, who we acquired via trade this year, Crawford, who's coming back from injury but had been in that rotation for a while, and then of course our two rookies that came up last year in Toll and Connolly Early, who played a big role for us, going into the playoffs and even in the playoffs, so my gut tells me that they're going to do whatever they have to preserve the depth, which means I'm guessing both Early and Toll will likely start the year in AAA, if for no other reason than that they have that additional depth there. I would love to see one of them as the fifth guy. And then the other question is, do they try to go to a 6-man rotation to start the year? They could do that because they do have that depth. So that'll be an interesting situation. And of course, I didn't even mention Patrick Sandoval, who's also coming back from injury, but he's also in that mix as well. And I would assume of the group of Oviedo, Crawford, and Sandoval, obviously, whichever ones do not make the rotation, whether it's a 5-man or a 6-man, will be in the back end of that bullpen, and showing up that spot as well. Because that's really where I'd say one of the biggest question marks is. The 7, 8, 9 of our bullpen is arguably one of, if not the best in baseball, with Slayton, Whitlock, and Chapman. We saw what Chapman did last year. But really, that whole trio, once they were healthy and back and pitching together, you get to the Red Sox bullpen in the 7th, and they pretty much were lights out, which is something we had not seen from a Red Sox team in a long, long time. So that's sort of locked up. And you've got a few other guys in that mix as well. Weissich, obviously there, Giovanni Moran, who we got last year in a trade, is in there. Zach Kelly has been sort of in and out of that spot for a while. Kyle Harrison, we got in a trade last year. We'll see, what they're thinking about with him. He's excuse me, he's going to run out of options and need to be somewhere at some point soon. So there's some names there. Ryan Watson is another name that's out there. So it'll be interesting to see where they go with the back end of that rotation. And I do think there's some back end of the bullpen. Sorry, there's a few spots up for grabs still, and I think spring training will determine some of that. Maybe even less to do with the performance of the bullpen pitchers themselves and more to do with who wins that rotation spot. Because if you figure you take two of those names I just kicked off, if they become, let's just say Oviedo wins the rotation battle just because we traded for him, and Crawford and Sandoval end up in that bullpen. That takes 2 of the 8 spots right there. We've already got 3, probably 4 really with Weissert locked in. There's only so many more positions after that to go around. So we'll see where that goes. And then our lineup is pretty much locked in as well. But here's the one interesting caveat that I wanted to actually bring up last week and I forgot to. And that has to do with second base, which is even more interesting now with the Kiner Falefa signing that we had this week. And it has to do with why they haven't signed a major starting infielder potentially yet. A couple weeks back, Breslow made a comment to the media about a veteran player who they've had taking ground balls at second base and has looked surprisingly great doing so. He refused to tell us which one it was because in typical Red Sox and Breslow fashion, we're just going to be cryptic and pretend, give just general statements and not tell us what's actually happening. But from that information, I deduced it's not Cedon, because if it was Cedon, he would say it's Cedon because Cedon's been playing in the infield a lot for us. And my gut tells me it has to be one of the outfielders because that's where they're trying to clear a spot for. It's not going to be, I don't think, Roman Anthony because he's young and they don't want to, he's their superstar, And my gut tells me it's Jarren Duran. And if you remember, when the Red Sox drafted Jarren Duran, he was a second baseman. They shifted him to the outfield, similar to what they did with Mookie Betts. And I think that might be the storyline to watch for the Red Sox. Are they shifting one of those outfielders, such as Duran, to second base to be a full-time starting second baseman? Because if they do, that drastically changes the complexion of this lineup. You go from Kiner Falefa or Romy Gonzalez as in your starting lineup to now being able to get all of Anthony, Rafaela, Abreu, and Duran in the lineup at the same time, and Yoshida. For all of the fact that Yoshida gets trashed a little bit because of how much money he got, and he doesn't really have the power there, he's not a bad hitter, pure hitter. You know what I mean? He doesn't fit the DH profile, and he has no defensive ability, it seems, really at all. And so he's sort of been a clog at DH, But if that did work out, you're suddenly looking at a very different Red Sox lineup. Obviously we improved at first base. It will also be interesting to see what they do with Casas. We talked about that at the time, and what having Contreras means for Casas and whether he'll get some play, at DH too, or maybe he takes over at DH for Yoshida, or if there's some platooning going on, or that'll be something to watch for too. Or if they're just waiting for somebody to lose their first baseman and they trade him completely. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Most of the rest of the lineup is pretty similar to what we had last year, with Marcelo Mayer coming back, hopefully healthy. Obviously, a full season Roman Anthony is going to be a big boost for them, and that could be the power hitter we've been looking for a while. He certainly has the power swing for it. He hasn't necessarily shown it in game numbers quite yet, but I certainly think we started to see flashes of it towards the end of last year, and we'll see if he can continue to build on that throughout the year this year. And then as far as, other prospects I'm interested to see in spring training, I'm very curious to see especially what they do with Christian Campbell, because he came up, he was our second baseman last year when he came up. He was the solution for second base because if you remember last year, we didn't have a second baseman either. This seems to be the second year in a row we're kind of going into spring training like, we're going to experiment and see what happens, which is concerning to me given how unfortunately Campbell ended up last year. He started off fantastic. Everybody was, hyping him up. He got signed to extension and then pretty much drove his car off a cliff, and got sent down. His defense has not really made the strides they're looking for, and they've essentially come out and said he can't play second base. He's not an infielder. If he's going to play anywhere, it's outfield, which, as we know, is already where our logjam is. So that doesn't really help him either. So I'm just, and they now have that extension on him, and they have to pay that no matter what. It's not like the situation they had before where they stuck Castillo, just poor Rusney Castillo down in minor leagues for all of eternity because if they did that, they didn't have to pay him. It's not that situation. They're paying him no matter what. So they're going to want to find somewhere to play him. So the question is going to be where, and then Franklin Arias is going to be another interesting one to watch because he is the other potential future answer in that infield. Obviously, he's not going to be ready for 2026, I don't believe, unless something insane happens, and he forces the issue, probably more like 2027, maybe mid 2027. But he's somebody I'm definitely watching to see how he handles big league club, and then obviously the pitchers that I already mentioned, Connolly, Early, and Peyton Toll will be interesting to see what they do and if they force the issue themselves, and see if they can crack a spot in that rotation. So
yeah, definitely. And the other thing that I think that Red Sox fans should be looking at is probably Mikey Romero, who is a non-roster invitee to spring training. He is, I believe, their number 6 or 7th prospect in their organization. Pretty strong infielder. Really is billed as a utility player, and he might possibly be second to IKF, depending on what they do with David Hamilton. Because don't forget, they still have David Hamilton as a secondary backup for a utility player. And he does have one more option, so we'll see what happens with that. But that actually leads me to the next section that I was going to go into, which thank you very much for doing. My Yankee non-roster invitees. Now, the Yankees have 5 NRIs that I think that fans as well as any baseball enthusiast should watch. The first one is George Lombard Jr., the number 25 prospect in all of baseball, possibly the successor to Anthony Volpe at shortstop. This kid has a very high mark in terms of fielding, rates around slightly above to above average in hitting, but about average in power, but is above average in run and arm strength. So Lombard Jr. last year had a bounce back from his not so good 2024, spent most of his time in Double-A with the Somerset Patriots. 215, 337, 695 OPS, which isn't great, but he's going to be 21 this year. He's going to be 20 to start, and he will be 21 on June 2nd. So he does have time to grow in that position, but he has displayed some great speed. 74 stolen bases in the last 2 years, which is nothing to sneeze at. It's not Enrique Bradfield levels. It's not Chandler Simpson levels, but it's still very, very strong base stealing numbers. And he does have some power growing in Double-A. He went up from 5 home runs to 9 home runs in 2025. They had 32 doubles in 2025 as well as 5 triples. So he does have on-base skill sets. The problem is that he strikes out a lot. 146 strikeouts to 111 hits, and that's on 473 at-bats. So his strikeout rate is nearing about 30%, which is high. That's a warning sign. That's something that need to get down. And that might be something that could be helped fixed, for lack of better terms, when he does face some major league pitching during spring training. So we'll see what happens with that. And they also have a second top 100 prospect in Carlos LaGrange, number 74 on MLB's top 100. He was great last year with Somerset. He was 7-6 with a 3.22 ERA, over 78.1 innings pitched. That's 15 starts as well as 1 bonus appearance in the middle of the game. 50 walks. So his walk rate is a little high. It's a little inflated. It's about 5 to 6, which is definitely not a number that you want to see. So you want to get it down to about 3 or 4. So that's something that will have to be worked on. But it has 104 strikeouts and 78 innings pitched at the Double-A level. And he only had a 185 batting average, opposing batting average against batters. So he has a lot of potential there, and he only surrendered 8 home runs in 120 innings pitched across both high A and double A. So the other thing is that you're going to have to watch is his fastball. It's a plus graded fastball with a plus graded slider, as well as 2 average secondary pitches in the cutter and a changeup. The only thing that he has to work on is control. If he can get his control down, there's a very good chance that he will appear at least in the bullpen in 2026, like I mentioned previously, where the Yankees have some holes left by Devin Williams and Luke Weaver signing with other teams. So that's something to really take note of. Now, with other NRIs that were not on the prospect top 100 list for MLB Pipeline, one of them is Ben Hess. So Ben Hess was one of their draftees, I believe, in 2025. Actually, 2024, he was their first rounder, and he was graded with a plus fastball as well as a plus curveball, which is always something that you want to see. You want to see somebody have a plus graded fastball and a plus graded secondary pitch, because that shows there's a foundation there. And with Somerset last year, which was his first year, or with Hudson Valley and Somerset last year, excuse me, which was his first professional year of pitching, he went 7-4 with a 3.22 ERA, 103 innings pitched with 139 strikeouts, and had better numbers than Carlos LaGrange. Only 3 home runs and 46 walks. Very good numbers across the board. Ben Hess, of course, still has a little bit of a heightened walk rate. It's at about 4.5. So like I said, 3 to 4 is the area you want to get it into. So he does have a little bit of work to do with that. But a 177 opposing batting average is fantastic, as well as a 1.07 whip. That's a great number that you want to see from your first round pick in 2024. And I would love to see what this kid does in spring training. I don't believe he's going to break camp, obviously, with the major league team. He only has 1 season. He's still in double A. He still has some time to work out any kinks in triple A. But he's a prospect to watch, and he could likely break the top 100 later this year if he continues to improve on his arsenal. And if he does develop a plus slider or a plus changeup, that's something you have to look at. That's something that puts him into rotation status, top 100 status, somebody to watch, somebody to go get in your fantasy leagues if you can play fantasy baseball, for all you fantasy nerds out there, for lack of better terms. And he's a big dude too. He's 6'5", 255. So he's a big dude. So I really want to see what he's able to do. And then the last one, or the last two, one of them is Brendan Beck, 27 years old, has been waiting for this opportunity because injuries have derailed him. He has proven himself at the AAA level. We'll see what he does at the major league level. I think he'll break camp, given the fact that it's more than time for him to get up there. And the other one that I'm looking at is Kyle Carr, the Yankees 2023 third round selection. Plus graded fastball, but average breaking pitches and sliders and changeup. And he does have some issues with control, which is something that drowned him in 2024. But he jumped in 2025. He went from a 4.76 ERA to an ERA under 2.7 in 2025 across high A and double A. Now, high A he shined at. Then he made the jump late in the year to double A. He struggled early. So we'll see what happens with him with regards to that. But if he's able to show something with his arsenal, maybe a refined arsenal, maybe refines a secondary pitch, maybe works on his control, then he'll be somebody to watch go up the board in terms of the Yankees farm system. He's ranked number 13 out of 30, so he might jump to somewhere within the top 10 if he's able to redevelop his arsenal as well as keep his walk rate down. Now, he does have to keep that walk rate down. It's at 4.7 at the moment. Like I said, same thing. Get it to 3.4 and see what happens. He also does need to get a strikeout rate up. It's under 9 per 9 innings, but he does have a good opposing batting average. It's just below the Mendoza line at 199, but I really am interested to see what some of these rookie pitchers can do. All right. So moving on to our next topic and just going through it really fast because we are starting to run out of time a little bit. I did write an article for Stadium Rant earlier this afternoon with regards to 3 teams that could potentially rise from the dead in 2026. I had 3 teams that I think could possibly have a much better record than in 2025 and possibly make a challenge in a ideal world for the playoffs. So the first one I had is the Athletics, or the Sacramento Athletics, or the Oakland Athletics, if you still call them that, which I don't blame you for. So with the Athletics, they've extended a lot of their core players: Lawrence Butler, Brent Rooker, Jacob Wilson, Tyler Soderstrom. They have a Rookie of the Year powerhouse in Nicholas Kurtz. But the problem is that they don't have a lot of pitching. And they also did add Jeff McNeil to their lineup, which is fantastic veteran presence. They just don't have a lot of pitching. They still have Luis Severino and Jeffrey Springs, which are serviceable, but they're not frontline starter material. So there's a lack of pitching depth there. The good news is that they have Gage Jump and Jamie Arnold, who are both top tier 100 pitchers, or top 100 prospect pitchers, excuse me. And they're still about a year or two away, especially Jamie Arnold. But keep watching Jamie Arnold. He could be a really special player someday, and he could lead that front line of the Athletics rotation going forward. The White Sox are another one. I think they're going to make the playoffs? Probably not. But they've made some serious moves. They made a big trade with the Mets to get rid of Luis Robert Jr. to free up some of their salary cap. Got Luis Angel Acuna as a utility player. Got rid of Garrett Crochet for a couple of prospects as well. They have 5 top 100 prospects. They also did get Munetaka Murakami, who everybody wanted to get at one point, and then issues with regards to his ability to hit fastballs or major league pitching. Those doubts started to eke in, and then the White Sox got him for a relatively good deal. I think it was about $15-20 million a year, maybe a little bit more or less, give or take. But it was a really good deal, in my opinion, because there's your power hitter for the future White Sox fans, which they've been clamoring for. And don't forget, they have a young core forming as well. Colson Montgomery, Kyle Teal, Chase Meridoff, big 3 players that could really have high ceilings. And they also do have 2 other lefty prospects like the Athletics in Noah Schultz and Hagen Smith. Both of them have struggled in 2025, but they can make a jump. And they also have Braden Montgomery as well that could possibly be an outfield anchor. And the last one, the Pittsburgh Pirates. Now, of course, Skeens is still the leader of that team, but they have made some serious moves to bolster their lineup, which was anemic last year. Ryan O'Hearn, Justinson Garcia. They got Brandon Lowe through a trade. 3 big moves by the Pirates to boost their, like I said, anemic offense. And they also have a really good pitching rotation in the works. They have Paul Skeens. They have Braxton Ashcraft. They'll have Bubba Chandler possibly starting. Jared Jones will be coming back from injury. They also have 2 good prospects as well in Seth Hernandez and Hunter Barco as lefty pitchers. So really, really interesting teams here that I think could make serious jumps in 2026 if they play all their cards right. So what do you think, Chris? Do you agree with me? Do you see any other teams that might be of watch in 2026?
Yeah, so you stole all 3 of mine. I was sort of thinking of, like, as far as like bottom dweller teams that could make their way up. So I guess I'll look at it a little bit differently. And talk about some teams that really underperformed last year that should bounce back. Or at least a couple that I think should. One of them being the Atlanta Braves. They just were decimated with injuries, all season long last year. And they didn't really make additions in the offseason, but they were still expected to be one of the top contenders last year. And they ended up, very quickly falling out of it. And so I would expect a huge bounce back from them, especially getting Acuna back. Hopefully, fingers crossed for the year. I think baseball is better when Acuna is healthy and ready to go. And so they're one team I'm watching. A second team, and we actually talked about them a little bit earlier, right in our own division, the Baltimore Orioles. I think should be back in it again and contending for a spot in the playoffs, if not making the playoffs for sure. I think they're still missing one more strong pitcher in the front of that rotation to compete with the Yankees, Blue Jays, and Red Sox rotations. I think they should have been the one to get Valdez. I said they weren't gonna be. Last week's podcast, I had obviously said the Giants. I was wrong about that. I don't think any of us necessarily predicted the Tigers per se, although it makes sense, knowing what we know now about Scooble. But so I think they're a pitcher away, but I do think that they're going to be in that conversation again now. And then the third team is the Texas Rangers. Their pitching should be great. still. And if they can figure out that offense, and get it back at least a little bit back towards where it was when they had their World Series run just 2 years ago. We forget. It feels like it's been the way the world has been going these days. It feels like it's decades ago, but it was only 2 years ago, and hopefully they can be right back in contention as well. So I guess those are the three teams that we sort of are used to having in recent memory, being contenders that I think, struggled a bit last year, but should be back in the conversation, this season, in my estimation and opinion.
All right, all right. Very interesting take. I didn't consider the injury angle. I considered more of the futuristic.
Mm-hmm.
What did you get in the offseason type of it?
Yeah.
Very interesting angle.
That's
I
where I
agree
was
with
going
all
at
three.
first until you took all my answers, and I had to pivot in my head real quick.
Of course, definitely. And again, I agree with all three too. Atlanta Braves decimated with injuries. San Francisco Giants have been kind of like between there and there. So we'll see what happens with them. Maybe they're still stuck in the 500 land. Maybe they pop up with Bryce Eldridge coming through the pipeline. Who knows? But we'll see. Now, moving on to our last subject, just to quickly round out the show. Are we confident in our teams in a World Series run? I will start with that. My answer to that is somewhat, to be honest with you. I'm not going to give a definitive yes or no answer because, like I said, there's good with the Yankees this year and there's bad with the Yankees this year. There is really just a sense of, like, again, number one, running it back. So we've seen what this team's able to do in a very good year with the right players. We've seen what this team has been able to do in a bad year with players that are good, but everybody else falling around them. It's, again, really going to have to come down to the rotation. Can the rotation stay healthy? Can Cody Bellinger keep up his 2025 pace? Can Aaron Judge continue to play at an MVP rate? That's a big question going forward for the next couple of years. Because don't forget, Aaron Judge is going to be 34 this year. His biological clock in terms of athleticism is ticking. So the question is, does he pull a Randy Johnson and his best years are yet to come? Is he going to fade away at the age of 36, 37, have a steep decline? I'm not sure, but that's something you have to consider. Looking at this Yankee team right now, of course they'll likely get into the playoffs, especially if Garrett Cole, Carlos Rodon both come back from injury and pitch fantastically. And if the rotation does its thing, scores runs, plays good fundamental baseball. And that's the other thing you have to consider. Can the Yankees play fundamental baseball this year? Because they made a lot of fundamental mistakes during that awful stretch in July and August in 2025. That's one thing you have to consider. So, with regards to the Yankees, are they poised for a World Series run? You can make that argument given their rotation when it's healthy. But at this moment in time, I still see them falling short. Maybe the ALCS, maybe a long, hard fought ALCS against a decent team. I wouldn't say the Houston Astros, because that's essentially their kryptonite in the playoffs. Maybe somebody like, again, the Red Sox, as they run into it. Toronto would absolutely destroy them again. Other team, maybe the Tigers, if they get to the ALCS with their lineup. We'll see what happens. But right now, I'm not very optimistic with the Yankees World Series chances. So what do you think about your team, Chris? Do you think you got World Series on your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do not necessarily know if the Red Sox did enough to be truly able to say they're World Series contenders. That being said, because of what Breslow specifically focused on with pitching and defense, if they catch, their pitchers are good enough where they could win a short series, with those pitchers bang, 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 and just not let a team score. That is entirely possible. So could I see a potential path to a World Series as the team stands now? I could. Do I think it's likely? No, because I don't think their offense is built enough to take on some of those other great pitching staffs that we'll see in the postseason. And I talked about it a little bit last season, when in the playoffs on this podcast, was that I think with a lot of these dominant pitching staffs, you need to have some power in there to be able to score runs quickly. And as the roster is constructed now, the Red Sox don't have that. They need to string a lot of hits together. And against really good pitching staffs, it's hard to get 3, 4, 5 hits in a row to score 2, 3, 4 runs. And so I think that's going to be their
Right.
kryptonite. I think if something happens, it's going to be, somebody that surprises us. Whether that's one of the non-roster invitees we talked about, Brendan Rodgers, or somebody like that in the infield coming in and surprising, or some of those bullpen pitchers, coming in and making us going from a very good bullpen to the best in the league. One NRI I did not talk about at all, and I won't get into him too deep because we're over time, but Noah Song is a non-roster invitee for us, and he is somebody that I'm very, very interested to see perform and see if he could become a Garrett Whitlock type for us at the back end of that bullpen.
All right. Very interesting take. So both of us think that World Series ambition, maybe, but not very likely. Some concerns, some doubts, reasonable doubts, but we'll see because, again, it is very early. Pitchers and catchers still have not reported yet. They will report right after the Super Bowl, and we'll start to see what everything looks like in spring training. So that is the end of our show. We are out of time, but we thank you very much for spending your Saturday night with us the day before the Super Bowl, talking baseball and looking forward to spring training. Like I said, once again, happening within the next couple of days with pitchers and catchers reporting. Later this month, February 20th, 21st, somewhere around there, we'll finally start to see some real baseball action. So we hope to see you for that. We will see you next week for another show of Dirty Leather. So for Khris and I, for Stadium Rant, we will see you next week. And if you are watching the Super Bowl, happy viewing and happy end to the football season and a happy start to the baseball season once that happens. Take care, everybody.
See you later.